Before we dive in, here's another show you can enjoy in the True Story FM family of entertainment podcasts.
Oh, there you are. I was hoping I'd cross paths with you today. I'd like to invite you to visit the Story Well. It's a place where storytellers of all stripes gather. From improv performers to authors, screenwriters to playwrights, we all tell stories. But we're not here to talk about craft. We're here to make something out of nothing. Each episode of the podcast, your host, that's me, sits down with a creative person, and based on a series of random prompts, we get elements that we make into a story. Will it be a noir novel about King Kong? Or a Broadway musical about JFK? Even we don't know. That's the fun part. But what do you get out of this, besides a good time with fun people? Simple. The idea is then yours. That's right. Whatever we come up with, we give it away for anyone to use however they'd like, no strings attached. It's like each episode comes with a free prize inside. The Story Well with Kyle Olson. We'll save you a seat at the table.
Ever wondered what happens when a Zoomer who grew up on the Clone Wars,
A millennial Anakin defender,
and a grumpy old Gen Xer walk into a cantina to talk Star Wars?
then we've got the podcast for you.
Star Wars Generations is a place for fans of all backgrounds to come together, talk about why we love the franchise, and what we can learn from each other.
With so much new Star Wars content coming out, we take a deep dive into all of it. We talk stories and characters, what we learn about the Force and the Empire, Republics old and new, and how each story adds to the larger picture.
Besides episode-by-episode coverage of the new shows, we've been going back to watch the movies in release order. We talk about Star Wars novels and video games, along with fan content and cosplay.
And with each episode, we're just starting the conversation, and we hope you jump in. We'll read your feedback, answer your questions. We've even had full episodes dedicated to questions raised by listeners like you.
You can find us under Star Wars Generations on your favorite podcast app or by going to theethicalpanda.com. May the Force be with you.
Now this is podcasting.
Hello and welcome to this episode of Superhero Ethics. Today we're giving you one of our member-only episodes where we're continuing this idea of the core questions. What are the things that are kind of like fundamental to any discussion of superhero ethics? And one of the topics that I think comes up again and again and again, and so we wanted to dive into pretty early on, is that of accountability, of superhero accountability, of who are superheroes accountable to, if anyone, should they be accountable to anyone? What should happen when something goes wrong? Should there be registration? Should there be oversight bodies? Should there be none of this, all those questions that sometimes get kind of summarized as Team Tony or Team Cap, but as we're going to talk about, are a lot more complicated than that. And we'll be using MCU's Civil War, both the comic books and the movie, and talking about some of the differences for those as a jumping off point. But we're not here to re-legislate what exactly happened in that movie or that comic book show or what should have happened. We're here to talk about this larger question of if there are people in the world who have powers far beyond what most of us have, and those people choose those powers to do their version of good, what should the rest of us do about it? And when something goes wrong, what should happen? I've got some kind of things I'm going to say to frame this discussion, but Riki, let's just starting out by that. Why don't you introduce yourself and give kind of your general thoughts on this topic and why you think it's an important one to discuss.
Yes, hello, Matthew and listeners and chat, I guess. We are live here. I'm Riki. And for me, the most important thing about this is that for the longest time, superheroes were framed as good. I mean, they are, right? They're heroes. Right. But the idea that they were not accountable there was never any discussion baked into these stories about that. Right. For the longest time. It was just assumed that they're good because they are. Right. And then we got this shift, I want to say maybe starting in the 80s, late 80s, 90s, where we got more stories that were focused on, well, what if superheroes were bad, right? Like the Watchmen is one of those big moments in comic books where the whole industry really shifted around it. And I think it set the tone for a lot of the stories that came later, asking these questions, like, literally who watches the Watchmen?
Yeah.
And then it developed, and we get to the point of Civil War in the comic books. And then, of course, in the MCU, really put that on the map for mainstream media,
Right.
especially the MCU version.
And I'll say that it's I'll say a long time ago on this podcast, we did a series of episodes with Jessica. Riki is before you became a co-host, I believe. Yeah, actually, it was long before, on the history of comic books. And one thing we talked about was that this moment in the like late 70s, early 80s, where we started thinking about these questions a lot more, it's not coincidental that that's happening at a time when a lot of people are starting to ask, are the police always doing good? Is the military always doing good? And frankly, I mean, people have been asking those questions for a long time. But between the comics code that we've talked about, and McCarthyism, and all sorts of stuff like that, those either weren't topics being discussed in mainstream America very much. It was thought of as like, oh, that's just the hippies, the liberals, their crazy ideas, or it was ideas that you couldn't talk about in comic books and things like that. And so part of this, and as I think we'll talk about, there's always been this conversation about, are superheroes kind of stand-ins for the police or for the military or for something else? And it's not coincidence at the same time we start talking a lot more about, war crimes in Vietnam and police brutality, that we start also asking about superheroes, like, what if they are not always doing good or trying to do good, but bad things are happening?
Yeah, well, you said the 70s, and immediately my mind went to President Richard Nixon.
Mhm.
Of course, the Watergate scandal and his ultimate resignation from the presidency really shook the country and the world to the core of this idea like the president committed crimes and
Right.
had to resign because of them. He was in the process probably of being impeached and being removed as president by Congress, and that really set the tone for people's like the public's perception of people in power.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it was always you would always be critical of presidents, probably like if you're an average citizen, be like, oh, I don't like this policy or that policy, but you accept their authority, like they're the president,
Right.
like they should be allowed to do all these things, etc. And that was the moment in history when people were like,
Right.
wait a minute, so you can't do that. Like even if you're president, you can't do that. And of course, like we are currently dealing with times where presidential power is once again being stretched and tested by the law. And we also coincidentally have a MCU story coming out as of this recording. It's releasing tomorrow in theaters. Captain America: Brave New World, where the president of the United States is like a villain figure in this
Right.
story
Definitely.
and
Definitely.
questioning his motives.
Now, before we jump into this too much, I do want to frame the discussion a little bit, which is saying that the questions of a lot of the questions we're going to discuss are questions that by nature are probably not going to be dived into in great degree in the media that we talk about themselves. And that's somewhat intentional. And it's part of what we like about this podcast is kind of getting to dive into those. And with superheroes, especially, I think there's two ways in which that comes forward. And one of these was really well spelled out by my brother-in-law, Joseph J. Dixon, in a post he made on Facebook in response to a question I asked, where he was talking about how one of the things that's weird about superhero media is that we fundamentally think of people as having superpowers in terms of their ability to do violence, in terms of their ability to be in confrontation. And he had suggested that actually, like, in a world of superheroes, you might think of like, a person with weather control could actually be incredibly helpful working with farmers and agriculture. But that doesn't really make for a Hollywood blockbuster in the same way. And in the same way, as we've often talked about, like Captain America and Tony Stark sitting in a room and talking back and forth about, well, should there be some accountability, but is registration too much? And what could different accountability look like? And how do we find a middle ground? And can we trust the government to do it, or should someone else? That doesn't make a big movie the way Captain America and Bucky and Tony Stark all punching each other does. And so we're kind of diving more into those questions a little bit and just kind of framing it that way. Just want to kind of start by saying, like, there's an extent to which we could peel open the whole superhero genre and say, like, well, but what if we went in these totally different ways? We're acknowledging that, yeah, the movies aren't going to do that, the TV shows aren't going to do that, but we still think it's important to ask these questions because, as you said, like, these are reflecting the real questions we're dealing with in our own world as well, and that's the whole point of this podcast.
Yeah, I will say that in the comic version of Civil War, both the characters of Daredevil and She-Hulk,
Mhm.
because they're day jobs as Matt Murdock and Jennifer Walters. They're attorneys.
Yeah.
So they actually like had, I would say, pretty big roles in like that desk job sort of way of not fighting or fighting in the court of law and challenging the
Yeah.
Superhero Registration Act in various ways.
So one of my favorite Jessica Jones one of my favorite Jessica Jones stories from the comic is about her dealing with a teenage girl who's pretending to be a superhero, because that's kind of like the girls who have superpowers as teenagers are kind of the outcasts, but therefore also kind of cool in like the high school way. And it's like it's a great story, like getting into all those details. And you're right, I do think one of the ironies of all this is that in general, the wider you make the audience, the less likely you are to deal with depth and nuance, and the more likely you are to have really awesome explosions. Because that's just the kind of like mass marketing versus like a comic book or a novel or something like that can often explore a lot more of these things. And a lot of the TV shows we've been seeing, I think, understandably, like, get into a lot more of those nuances for those kind of reasons. So let's talk about let's talk about the questions we're dealing with. And Civil War starts with an incident, and I know it from the movie, and the book is probably comic book's a little bit different. I don't want to legislate exactly what Wanda did or didn't do, but I think that a situation like what happens at the start of Civil War is a good place to start this question of accountability. So let me start by asking you, Riki. Superheroes are out in the world. They have identified what they think is something bad. They are taking action to stop something bad. As a result of the actions they take, innocent bystanders die. Now, there's lots of questions about this of like, could they have done something so that those innocent bystanders wouldn't die? Would more innocent bystanders have died if they'd done something else? Obviously, there's all these questions surrounding it. What should happen next? In your mind, in a perfect world, what would happen next?
There should be an investigation
Mm-hmm.
and fact finding, and it should be determined by the investigating body whether the heroes acted in a proper way
Yeah.
and how responsible they are for the deaths. So you mentioned the comic version. The comic version is like much more stark. No pun intended. It is I can't even remember the name of the group, but it's like some throwaway, not the young Avengers, but like young Avenger type, like kids who
Right.
have powers, like, and they are filming a reality TV show. So like that's the level of superhero they are. They don't care as much about the saving people. They're like doing it for the clout.
Right.
And they like in trying to apprehend a super criminal, they cause like this criminal has like atomic powers and they cause him to explode. And
Mm,
basically like it goes off as a nuke and like a city is destroyed.
right.
And that is the inciting incident of comic Civil War. So it's much more like of an irresponsible
Oh,
moment,
interesting.
especially because it's like filmed, right? Like this camera crew is filming them, so everyone has the footage, and like these kids are like cracking jokes and stuff, and like we got
Right.
this, it's easy.
So the idea that like superheroes existing in the way that they do without any change is totally fine. Like that's just not a part of the like I think you could look at what happens in Nigeria and what happens to the Wakandan students, and there's an argument certainly of like, look, yeah, maybe Wanda should have been better trained or whatever, but like just let Cap and them handle it. That's not an argument that can even be made, it sounds like, in the comic book version. Like it's very clear something is not right with the way superheroes are getting to act.
Yeah, I think the movie kind of tries to parallel that by making Wanda the one responsible because she's the newest member of the team. She's young, she wasn't a part of the Battle of New York, etc. So they're trying to frame it as like, well, she's inexperienced, but
Right.
they never truly touch upon it in the same way that I think the comics were like, who the heck let these kids play superhero, right? That's kind of like
Yeah.
the framing.
Yeah.
And that's how it's approached of like this superhero thing has gotten out of control because in the comics, of course, there's hundreds,
Right.
whereas in the movies it really is like this core dozen or so at this time.
Right. It's a much smaller group.
Yeah, so it's less so in the movie about like the idea of superheroes kind of getting out of control, I think,
Right.
and it's more like these people.
And it's interesting because I think I've talked about this before. I don't want to get stuck just too much on Civil War itself, but one of my frustrations with that is that it winds up pitting the idea of the Sokovia Accords against any kind of accountability. And
Yeah.
where Cap winds up kind of standing behind a position of like, no, let us handle it. No one else should be thinking about it except us. And it sounds like, at least in the comics, there is some acknowledgement of some degree of accountability is probably good, but the Sokovia Accords are not the right way to do it. And it becomes a conversation about registration and all of that. Do you think that's an accurate description about what happens in the comics?
So I would say that there's two main differences in
Mhm.
in the comics version versus MCU. One, in the comics, it is USA based,
Right.
like solely. It is like the US government saying we have to control superheroes. Whereas the MCU, the Sokovia Accords, is a United Nations resolution, right? So
Right.
it's an international agreement. And I think that's a very important distinction.
Right.
And then the second part, yeah, as you mentioned, it's about registration. Like the key thing, it's called the Superhero Registration Act. And it decrees that if you are going to vigilante or like legal ante, if you are going to act as a superhero to fight crime, then you have to register with the US government, which
Right.
includes, most importantly, revealing your secret identity.
Right.
And Spider-Man Peter Parker becomes the key person in this struggle because he's Spider-Man. Like he has kept his secret identity hidden for the longest time amongst this community, and importantly for his character, because Norman Osborn, the Green Goblin, discovered his identity, he targeted Gwen Stacy and ultimately murdered her. And so because of that incident, he holds his secret identity very closely because
Right.
he doesn't want, now Aunt May or MJ to become hurt or targeted as a result of his activities as Spider-Man.
Right.
And that's like always been a part of his story. So he ends up revealing his identity in a press conference where he says, I'm Spider-Man, takes off his mask, and my name is Peter Parker, and he joins Team Tony.
That was just a small part of our bonus member episode that all members of the Ethical Panda podcasts get once a month for both this podcast and our Star Wars Generations podcast. You can always become a member for only $5 a month, $55 a year. You get to support our podcast. You'll get ad-free content. You'll get bonus content at the end of most of our episodes. And of course, you get once a month episodes like that. And most importantly, you get to help support the podcast. And it is folks like that who are just the lifeblood of this podcast, who help make it possible for us to keep the lights on, for us to keep giving you the content we do week after week. So please think about becoming a member. All the information is on the show notes. Thank you so much, and may the Force be with you.